unable to make it, but who really wanted to listen in. So welcome. My name is Rhonda Cruzy, and I'm the transitional presbytery leader for Lehigh Presbytery, and who's hosting this. And I'm really welcoming all of you. I think there are people from all around the synod, and so we're glad that you could join us today. I'm going to open us with prayer, and then we'll begin. Holy God, we come before you humbled by the experience of a coronavirus pandemic that once again appears to be out of control in our country. So many of the plans that we've made for this year have just not come to pass, and now we're facing the holiday season as well as a season of spiking cases. Remind us once again, oh God, that through all of it, you are with us and that you hold us in your loving hands. We thank you for the people to whom you've given the gifts and the wisdom and the courage to work towards solutions for coronavirus, for treatments and for a vaccine. We thank you for those people to whom you've given the gifts and the wisdom and the courage to lead us through coronavirus as difficult decisions must be made. Bless our time together today, that we might learn from one another and grow in our knowledge and our faith and renew our trust in your abiding presence. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
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 Once again, I'm going to briefly introduce our guests. Rich Horth received his PhD from Columbia, and he's a retired virologist with 35 years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry. He's a recognized expert in vaccine development and is currently working with PATH, which is part of the Gates Foundation. Is that right, Rich?
Yes, it is.
Okay. On a coronavirus vaccine, and he's an elder at First Bethlehem here in Lehigh. Bill Bartlett is also an elder here in Lehigh at First Easton, and he received his PhD in biochemistry with a focus on immunology from Dartmouth Medical School, then spent 4 years as a postdoctoral fellow at the Medical College of Virginia, and has been at Sanofi Pasteur for 22 years, and is currently a deputy director in the Global Clinical Immunology Department. And then finally, we have Lisa Allgood, who is trained as an immunocytochemist and as a graduate of University of Medicine and Dentistry, New Jersey, and spent 36 years as an executive in the pharmaceutical industry. She is a commissioned ruling elder, currently serving as executive presbyter, no longer transitional, yay, for the Presbytery of Cincinnati. So we're glad to have these three folks here, and we're going to let them talk about what they're doing in the area of research or how they're addressing the virus in their own work. And then we'll open it up to questions. And if you put your questions in the chat, then we'll be able to make sure that they see them. So we're going to start with Lisa this time. Can you start, Lisa? Tell us what.
Yeah, so I mean, I think last time we talked about what the virus is and what it does. Do you want me to go through that again, or do you just want to talk about where we are in terms of infectiveness and current pandemic?
I think maybe just go with where we are now.
Okay.
And then if people have any background questions, they can ask those.
Okay, so it's a bad virus. Let's just start there. It's not one you want to play with. We've talked about this being 10 times more fatal than the flu virus, not nearly as fatal as other viruses, but it is 3 times more infectious than most of the other respiratory viruses that we've seen. Right now, all 50 states are spiking. They're spiking in terms of the positivity rate of testing. They're spiking in terms of the rate of infection, which is in the spread mode. There's nothing that's quiescent at this point. They're also spiking in terms of hospital and medical center utilization. I know here in Hamilton County, over the last 3 weeks, we have had 600% more admissions to hospitals than we had since July. And so, and it's just out of control. It is very much out of control. The infection rate in the US is about 15 times that of the rest of the world. There are 142 countries right now that are also experiencing spikes and going back into regional lockdowns. Nobody's locked down an entire country yet. And I think that's what the CDC is now recommending, that I know President-elect Biden is considering, which is targeted lockdowns or mandates in certain areas where the spikes are worst. The World Health Organization has now declared coronavirus COVID-19 to be endemic, which means that it's not going away. This is a virus we expect to live with. That's why the vaccine development is so important. What else? I think the rest of it, really, the numbers seem to be the same, in the sense that as we've learned more about this virus over the last 9 months, 40% of those who are infected remain asymptomatic. That number hasn't changed. Pre-symptomatic patients, those who will develop symptoms but have not yet, and who are still shedding virus, so are still infectious, that can be up to 8 days before symptoms emerge. One of the most recent studies that came out was across 3 centers. I actually think Dartmouth might have been one of them, that looked at children. What was the prevalence of the virus in children 4 to 17, 90% of whom generally remain asymptomatic unless they have an underlying medical condition. And it turned out that kids who are asymptomatic have 25 times the amount of virus in their nasal passages than hospitalized adults. And so they can be very significant vectors of community spread. We now have documented cases of reinfection. There have been there were originally a handful that were documented and verified in the US. There are now hundreds that are in the process of being documented and verified. It looks like the reinfection is not because the virus becomes latent in the system, where it reemerges, something like chickenpox and shingles or herpes. It actually looks like there's a mutation on the protein spike of the virus. And so once someone has had the viral infection, whether or not they've recovered, they actually get a second infection because the protein spike that attaches the virus to the cell is different. It has not yet been shown that there are mutations that are due to the genetic material. There have, however, been shown, and this is very typical for viruses, although it sounds scary, that there are genes within the genetic material of COVID-19, and that now is being investigated for possible sources of mutation. That also becomes important when we start to talk about the vaccines that are coming out at this point. Currently, World Health is reporting more than 56 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 globally, more than 1.3 million reported deaths. There are currently about 18 million cases documented globally that are being managed. We have more than 11.5 million confirmed cases in the US and more than 250,000 deaths. So that's the fun news.
Okay. Who wants to go next? Rich?
Bill, you want?
Or Bill?
Either way, one of us.
I can talk from the virus point of view, and I guess Bill talks more the antibody point of view.
Okay.
I've worked with Bill at Sanofi Pasteur for years too,
Yes.
so we're friends. Let me just give you some highlights about virus. First of all, I wanted to say all these people that Lisa was mentioning who are dying and getting infected, you can bet that most of the people who died did not thought they were safe, thought they were taking precautions, and they made mistakes. And you only need to make one mistake. And I know everyone's fatigued right now, and so people kind of let down their guard, and only once, and you're screwed. And so in terms of vaccine, we can get into that a little later, but the message of hope I'd like to give everyone is you've been hearing about the vaccine, and it's just a matter of let's hold on until perhaps April, when we can all have the vaccine. So the lights at the end of the tunnel. Just keep being good for a little longer, and we're going to make it. Don't let down your guard. With regard to transmission, the evidence is really piling up that it is by aerosol, almost exclusively now.
Yep.
People have been challenging aerosol advocates. There's been a big debate in the scientific community. They've been challenging them and say, well, prove it. Well, now they go to hospitals and people with COVID, and they take air sampling with air sampling machines, and they find the COVID in the air, in the aerosols, and they find it in the room, not just right next to the patient. And a virus can survive in the air for over an hour. The half-life, just before you lose half of it, is over an hour in the air. So just think about being near a smoker, and if you smell the smoke, that's kind of similar to an aerosol. We have to focus more on aerosols and less on foam mites. I think the evidence right now is saying no more than 6% of transmission happens from foam mites. That's people's fingers or things that you touch. Everyone's going around sanitizing surfaces, and at most that's 6% of transmission from what I'm reading. I just went to PubMed, and if any of you, that's the National Library of Medicine, just type in PubMed and you can go and see the most current articles. You can type in COVID or something like that. The other thing about it being in the air is you usually need about 15 minutes of time in the air before you really are getting into trouble. And what is the reason for this? And the reason is that just think of, many of you know about the parable of the seeds, where the sower of Jesus talking about sowing the seeds, and some seeds fall on rocks and some fall in fertile soil. So if you're getting exposed, think of the virus as being the seed, and it's not always going to go to a place where it's going to infect you. And some people think actually you have to breathe it in, it has to get into your lungs and infect you. But that's one thing. And the other thing is we have host defenses, natural host defenses that we've developed in order to resist viruses. And so those defenses mean that for flu virus that they've studied more, that you need about 10,000 particles, infectious particles, to break through the host defenses and infect somebody. So you need to one virus usually doesn't do it unless you're really unlucky. So multiple viruses are like an assault, a charge on your immune system, and some of them break through. Let's see. So I wanted to point out that, as Lisa mentioned, that the spread of symptomless is like people is like 40%. And so if people are thinking about fever screening, if you have church or church schools or something like that, screening people by fever might catch a third of the people. So don't rely on it too heavily. It's fine to do it, but don't rely on it too heavily. Now they've just had some recent studies. Why do some people die and other people don't? You see these 30-year-olds who are bodybuilders and they die from COVID, and granted, as you're older and you're overweight, your risk is a lot higher. But I just saw a neat survey that said that some of these people have antibodies to their own interferon. Now, many of you have probably heard of interferon. Interferon is your natural antivirus response that's other than antibodies. It just kicks in fairly soon after you get infected. Well, and they looked at people who had severe infections and compared them with people who had mild infections, and they found that the people who had severe infections were much more likely to have antibodies to their own interferon, like an autoimmune situation, or to have defective interferon production. And so the thing is, none of us know. We don't know what our interferon status is. That would take a lot of study of one person. And so you just never know if you're going to be one of those people. So let me move on for a minute. Oh, here's another study. They looked at people who had COVID versus people who didn't, age matched and everything else matched. And the people who had COVID were 3 times as likely to have visited a restaurant within the last 2 weeks. And they were 4 times as likely to have visited a bar in the last 2 weeks before their infection. And so that again has to do with aerosol transmission. And then I saw a study in Japan or China where they looked at little super spreader events. And at 318 they looked at, only none of them were outdoors. They were all indoors. So outdoors is good. And so can I talk a little bit about churches, thinking about opening churches? Of course, as we discussed last time, but just to review, you want to get airflow through. And so if open the windows and put the air conditioner, if you can control it, turn the fan up high and don't have it recirc. If you have that option, have it flowing through and out. Just get as much outdoor air in there as possible. Also, little air purifiers work fairly well. And of course, if you have option to put filters on your air conditioners, get the tighter filters that are similar to HEPA filters. That works as well. So I talked with a neighbor who said, oh, well, we've been meeting in our church and we've been singing and we don't have no COVID. And he said, well, how big's your church? Well, we have about 30 people who come. And I said, you're kind of playing Russian roulette, that just because you don't have COVID right now, as soon as you get somebody who does have COVID in there, then it's going to spread. And so I suggest assuming everybody you come in contact with has COVID, because you just don't know, and taking the proper precautions. And also another study that showed that virus doesn't survive in your hands for very long. So even if you don't wash them. And so finally, let's see, masks. I wanted to mention, of course, all the social distancing masks and all that. Masks are at least 50% effective, depending on the fit, depending on the type of mask you wear. And a good rule of thumb is to hold it up to the light. If you can see through it, that's not so good as one that you can't see through it. In fact, when I go to the store to shop, I try to go like at 8:30 at night when there's not too many people on a rainy night, and I put a sleep mask over my face because they block out the light, and then I put another mask on top of it. The more layers you have, the safer you are. And just think, if you have a mask and let's say it's only 50% effective, but the other person is wearing a mask, that's 50% effective. And so you add them up and you have 75% effectiveness against virus spread. So I think we can talk about a vaccine later on, and maybe Bill wants to talk about that. And certainly I've been working on a vaccine more than I would have liked, but there's vaccines coming, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay,
Bill.
thanks, Richard. Thank you, Lisa. I guess from my perspective, looking at evaluation of the anti-COVID immune response, obviously there's a lot of work being done on testing for antibodies, and in particular, there's more and more emphasis on neutralizing antibodies. Those are antibodies that don't just see the virus, they're able to neutralize or kill the virus. And so across the community that's working to respond to the virus, that's where a great deal of the focus is. As you know, there's been a lot of coverage of vaccines that are under development. There are many vaccines that are in the process of being developed. The two that there's been the most information on have been both mRNA-based vaccines, in which a small amount of nucleic acid from the virus is given as a vaccine. It's a relatively new type of vaccine that's in use. The technology isn't so new, but the use in a vaccine is fairly novel. And I think most, if not everyone, has seen the information from press releases and in the standard news outlets for both the Moderna vaccine, which had information released, I believe it was earlier this week, and then also the Pfizer vaccine. Again, both are mRNA based. Both have shown really high efficacy, 90 to 95%. When they talk about efficacy, that means that they've done a very specific type of trial. They enroll a high number of people, I think in the vicinity of 30,000 people for each of them. And they administer their vaccine to half of the people and a placebo to the other half. And then they observe and see essentially who gets sick, as well as taking samples to evaluate the immune response. And 90 and 95% efficacy means that the vast majority of cases that they have seen have been in the placebo group. One of the things, and this type of vaccine, of clinical trial rather, is new. This, not the type of clinical trial. Let me say that again. Because the illness, the infectious agent, is new, we don't have methods to just test people's serum, test people's blood, to determine if they're protected. So that's why we have to do an efficacy trial, to demonstrate with a very high degree of assurance that people are being protected by the vaccine. As we go forward and develop more, we're looking at laboratory tests that can correlate or indicate protection. And in fact, I was on a webinar, viewing a webinar earlier today that was very much focused on that identification of what are called correlates of protection, so that going forward, perhaps quite as large trials wouldn't be needed. Efficacy could be shown by another means. I think the efficacy that we're seeing in the two trials that have been talked about, while I tend to be very skeptical of science by press release, because you're seeing a perspective on the data. Certainly a company like Pfizer, Moderna, I don't expect to be presenting faulty data, but you are seeing a perspective on the data. When they apply for licensure to the regulatory agencies, they will be presenting all of their data. When you see a publication in a scientific journal, they've presented the majority, if not all, of their data, and it's been reviewed. So I have a little bit of skepticism regarding the 90-95%, but I do think it's highly likely that the vaccines are quite effective. The one thing that is still unknown and everyone, believe me, wants to know this, is an indication of the duration of protection. We know that some people can be reinfected. I did see some data in that webinar that I was viewing earlier today that suggested that well out into 100, 150 days post-infection, a high number of people, a percentage of people, were still protected. So that is cause for hope. We still need to do additional testing, monitoring to see really how long the immune response to these candidate vaccines persists and continues to give protection.
Yeah, Bill, if I can jump in on that.
Sure.
So I actually have seen the Pfizer data. I haven't seen all of the Moderna data yet. And yeah, they're at 90% efficacy. I mean, they really have shown that. And if they have, and Moderna's announced 90, 95, I would tend to believe them as well. So be reassured on that one. There's a question in the chat about somebody's paper said that Pfizer's vaccine wasn't effective in senior citizens. Actually, the data is the opposite. Most vaccines have a variability of effectiveness across an age range. Both Pfizer and Moderna do not, and they tested both children, and I know that because they tested it here at Children's Hospital in Cincinnati, as well as senior citizens, and it's showing remarkably consistent effect across age ranges, which is really, really good news. Here's the thing, though. So, Bill, you're absolutely right. We need to know more about the duration of the effect. The duration of the effect that they've measured is antibodies. That's only one of two measures of efficacy. So even if antibody titer goes down over time, the innate T cell response that Rich was talking about is probably still kicking in. That's a lot more difficult and very expensive test to run. So those tests have not been run yet. And it's not clear. You're absolutely right. We may be in an annual vaccine. I think there are three other things to think about in the vaccine that some of this we've talked about. Both the mRNA vaccines, one, have never been commercialized in the US and require extreme refrigeration. Pfizer's is like down to minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit. That makes distribution and storage difficult. They're working on that, and they're working with large pharmacy distribution channels right now. So everyone is aware of that one. The other piece of it is it's not the vaccine that's going to take care of this virus, it's the vaccination that's going to take care of the virus. And the latest study that came out said 50%, roughly 50% of the United States is still saying they won't get the vaccine because they don't trust what they see in the media and they don't trust the safety data, which, by the way, looks very, very good. If that's the case, then because this is efficacy for a vaccine is defined on a population basis. So 90% of the population that gets the vaccine will be protected. That's what that 90% means. If only half of the population is getting it, that means only 45% of the population is protected. That's not enough to start getting us off of masks. And so one of the biggest things that I think you're going to see are some, and I'm just going to call them public relations campaigns to make sure people understand the vaccination is safe, the vaccination is appropriate, and you really should get it. And you probably really need to listen to that because I know it's tough. I know there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of opinion out there, but we're not getting past this if people aren't getting vaccinated. I saw another report this morning that one of the more traditional modes of vaccine development that we've talked about before, I think it was, remember it was AstraZeneca's vaccine, which is not the genetic material. It's based on the protein spike that injects the genetic material into the cell and starts the replication. That one is also showing some promise. I didn't see data, it's not 90%, but it may be another vaccine that we will have in our sort of armamentarium to see what we come up with. And they haven't released data yet, but they're starting to get to enough patients where they can look at it. I know Pfizer is intending to file with FDA for emergency use authorization this week. It will take FDA at least a month to look at it. They've already got their advisory committee in place. They are pre-producing millions of doses of vaccines. They believe they can start vaccinating medical personnel, first-line responders, and then into nursing homes probably sometime by the end of December. Most of us won't see it until probably March or April, as has been said. But we're not out of the woods. Even though the vaccines are a great light at the end of the tunnel, there's a lot more work to do with these. I think the other thing that's worth saying is that the mutations that are being seen, like I said, for reinfection are on the protein spike. There are not any yet on the mRNA. So if Moderna and Pfizer's vaccines really do turn out to be as efficacious and safe as they say, it should be a much more long-lasting protection, even with boosters, because the mutations won't affect it. So lots and lots and lots of data to process here. I understand that.
But I would like to point out that of all the other viruses and bacteria out there, no viruses are completely, no vaccines are completely effective.
Right.
And also there are, for all the other diseases, there are some people who just don't mount a good response to an infection. And so you're going to get reinfection. So I wouldn't think that this virus is so unique. It's pretty common.
That's right. Well, and David just asked the question, if only 45% of your church population, your congregation is protected because half haven't gotten the vaccine yet, what does that do to your decision making? You're exactly where you are now. If the virus is still out there and viral infections are still going on, we've talked before about creating a decision tree. What needs to be true for you to feel comfortable going back into in-person worship? I know there's an Orwellian 1984 suggestion that we will be carrying vaccination papers with us for a little while. And that may be, I would hate to allow people into worship Jesus Christ on the back of a vaccination paper, but maybe that's the world we're going to live in for a little while. I hope not.
Bill, were you finished? Maybe you had some more, or you done?
I was pretty much done. I do want to echo what Lisa said. A vaccine does no good while it's sitting in a vial. So it will be hugely important for us, for our own health and for the health of those around us, to get a vaccine once it's licensed. And when it's licensed, it will have demonstrated both safety and utility, efficiency, effectiveness, efficacy, however you want to phrase it. So I really do encourage people to get that as well. And I think probably many people have already heard this. There is a concern, especially at this time of year, for a combination between the COVID and influenza. And we do have a vaccine for influenza. And while it does not protect you for COVID, and I don't want to give that impression, you can go a ways in protecting yourself against some of the circulating respiratory viruses that are out there by getting yourself an influenza vaccine for those who can, which is most people.
Well, in fact, there's a couple of cases of people being infected with both flu and COVID already, and that's not something you want.
No.
Do at the same time.
That's right.
There was a question that someone asked. He says, we are cleaning our church pews every week when we are having services. Can you confirm that if the sanctuary is only used once per week, can we stop spending all this time and energy cleaning our spaces? Second question,
Yes.
and there wasn't, yes,
Oh.
okay, there was an article in the New York Times today that talked about that it's not about the surfaces, it's about the airflow that people
Good.
that really need to be taken care of or paying attention to. And then the second question, your speaker said that it takes 15 minutes for the virus to be transmitted. So why are people taking a casual walk in the park and not interacting with anyone wearing masks?
Well, they're outside in the park, so they've got a great ventilation flow of natural air that dilutes the virus as opposed to being in an enclosed space. That 15 minutes is really about being in an enclosed space. And I want to amplify that too. There are two factors that determine infectivity. One is the amount of time. So 15 minutes is maximum exposure. CDC's actually modified their position on that in the sense that it used to be 15 consecutive minutes. Now it's 15 cumulative minutes over the course of 24 hours. But the other is the amount of virus. And I think Rich touched on this, the amount of virus that you're exposed to. So I'm going to put this into a sanctuary context. If you're in your sanctuary for 30 minutes, even if you've cut your service time in half, not only are you at twice the time, but you're getting twice the virus exposure because it's cumulative. So it's not like 15 minutes and I'm done. If you've got maximum time at 15 minutes, you're still getting additional virus for the other 15. But anytime that you're outside and walking, masks are always a good thing. There's no risk-free to live right now. And everything you do is another layer of protection. So being outside is a layer of protection. A mask is an additional layer of protection. 6 feet distance is an additional layer of protection. And that's the way you should really be thinking about all of the advice that you're being given about what you can do to avoid being infected in the first place.
Can we go back to that first question that I think it was Rich just said yes to? The question of scrubbing surfaces.
Now the virus, go ahead.
The article says, but scrubbing surfaces does little to mitigate the virus threat indoors, experts say, and health officials are being urged to focus instead on improved ventilation and filtration of indoor air. So I know that some churches are really doing the wiping down and all of that. Can that be backed off on a little bit, or?
Well, in my opinion, I think there is more than an opinion. The virus will die in 2 or 3 days on the surface. And so what I tell our church is if we have some people, I mean, we have virtual services only inside, but we have a few people inside even then. And so I say, just leave it. And in 2 or 3 days, it's all going to die on its own. The heat will kill it. The virus is pretty fragile, thank goodness. And so just leave it alone and don't bother to ruin your pews by putting cleaners all over them or whatever.
I mean, I think for the most part, that's right. I think the data I've seen says it lasts 3 to 4 days on an impermeable surface. So if there is one impermeable surface that people touch a lot and touch repeatedly, light switches, doorknobs, I think those are worth still wiping down. The admonition that your grandmother told you to wash your hands is always a good idea, no matter what, just because there are so many germs that you come in contact in the course of a day. I think, things like hymnals and backs of pews that literally are not going to be touched for 7 days probably don't require cleaning.
And if you think about touching the, let's say after 3 days, there's still a little virus left and you touch that virus, then it gets on your finger and you lose quite a bit of it in the transfer. Transfer is not that efficient. And then let's say you touch your eye and then you're going to lose a lot more in the transfer there. So I guess the point is you need a certain amount of virus to break through
Right.
and transmitting. In fact, tuberculosis, for years, they thought it was spread by droplets and by surfaces, and it took them decades. And now they've shown it's exclusively spread by aerosol only.
Right.
And so it's still a good idea to wash your hands and everything. I wouldn't go overboard in terms of cleaning everything all the time.
Yeah, I would agree. There's a question too about electrostatic fogging guns, and we've talked a little bit about air cleaners and air filters, and I honestly don't understand the fogging gun at all. I have to look into that. But the bottom line is any of those things will clean the air that's coming out of the machine. If that air is flowing over someone who's infected, that air is no longer clean. And that's really the way you need to think about it.
Maybe this is a question for Bill, is the April timeline realistic to manufacture, distribute, and administer a vaccine to the entire population of the United States?
Well, and that's one I definitely wanted, I spotted and wanted to respond to. I'm responding not as an employee of Sanofi, but just based on knowledge of the industry as a whole. And the April time to bear in mind is that that's really when it's expected to start to be able to be rolled out to the general population.
Right.
So the person who asked that question is exactly right in questioning whether that would be able to cover the entire nation in that time frame. It won't. It will start to get to the general population in that time frame. So then it will be a question of efficiency from a logistical standpoint of distributing the vaccine and administering the vaccine and the willingness of people to receive the vaccine. It will be an excellent start, but we are going to be living with COVID, with the virus, for a certain amount of time. So April, it's not going to be black and white. It's not going to be a yes, no situation. Come April, we will start to get better in terms of protection, but it's going to take a while.
What I'm recommending to our church is that we plan on Easter services indoors, and that we say everybody who's been vaccinated is welcome to come. Our guys, they usually follow directions. If you've been vaccinated, you're welcome to come. We'll still wear a mask, but that's our target. We're thinking we're going to have Easter indoors.
There you go.
I would like to ask a question if I could, concerning, have there been any surveys or studies of people who sleep using a CPAP machine all night?
There have not been any specific studies with people who use a CPAP machine that I'm aware of. This is just at this point, just a general large scale safety and efficacy study. Those kinds of specialty studies will have to come.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, I haven't seen any either.
Yeah.
Nor I.
But my gut feeling without any evidence is that would be that much of a problem.
Hello?
Yes. Does somebody have a question?
Ivana, you're on mute.
Okay. People
Go
of
ahead.
color. How many people of color and different ethnicities have been these vaccines been tested on? What are the rates of success?
So I don't have data to give you, but I can tell you that the clinical protocols that describe the conduct of these studies made a very large point of ensuring that they were multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-age, multi-gender. And that
That's right.
includes both women and men of color and in any ethnicity that you care to name, as well as Hispanics specifically. And so there are significant numbers in these studies. It was beautifully conducted. I did not see a breakout on efficacy. They haven't released that data yet, so I don't know if there's a difference in efficacy. Like I said, there wasn't an age. That's pretty typical for a vaccine. So the fact that there wasn't an age leads me to believe they didn't see anything significant across races either. But I haven't seen any specific data there. It's a good question.
There is a good comment from Scott Bowerman in the list, noting a report in the Wall Street Journal today that 40% of those in the studies were
BIPOC, yeah.
BIPOC, yeah.
And they really did make a very concerted effort to make sure that they were covered, because we knew from the very beginning that was a population that was much, much harder hit because primarily of underlying medical conditions. There's also a question in there, Bill, and I'm gonna let you answer this and see if I have the answer right. How long does it take for the vaccine to be considered effective?
Typically, it would be 2 weeks.
And so that would really be 2 weeks after a booster shot as well. So roughly a month after the first shot.
Well, definitely for those vaccines which are 2-shot administrations, and I think both the Moderna and Pfizer ones are.
Yep.
There are some of the ones that are currently in development which are intended to be single-shot administration, but that's going to depend on the data from the trials.
Right. Good. I would have had the answer right. I feel better.
I wanted to mention too that the reaction rate to the vaccines, there's about a 3.5% rate of fever, and also people get very tired for a day or two after the vaccine. And I believe that rate is about 3.5%. So there is a price. You take a little risk of that, but for me, it's still definitely worth it. It sure beats being dead.
Well, there you have it.
Yep.
Can one of you speak to any research that's been conducted concerning the other effects of COVID other than death to the lung and the heart and the neurological issues? Is there what research is being done?
Oh, I think Lisa knows about that.
Yeah, that's probably my specialty, actually, sadly. I mean, we gave you numbers the last time. For every 1 death, there are 19 hospitalizations, 18 permanent or long-term cardiac damage, and I'll come back to that one, 10 long-term or permanent, and these are permanent lung damage. I think I told you last time I've seen MRIs of lungs of young female cross-country runners, which are probably some of the healthiest lungs in the world, and there's permanent scarring at the base of the lung from the pneumonia. There are 3 permanent kidney issues. The virus has been shown now to get into the gastrointestinal tract. It's getting into the thyroid, which is causing metabolic issues. It goes into the pancreas, which can be a cause of diabetes. The most tricky one is the fact that it's obviously getting into the central nervous system, because one of the cardinal symptoms is loss of taste, loss of smell. They have shown the virus crosses the blood-brain barrier, so it's actually getting into the brain. It has been shown to cause everything in terms of long-term neurologic sequelae, from trouble walking to a prolonged loss of taste and smell to psychosis. So it's really got a wide range of symptoms. The other rather insidious thing that this virus does, and the mechanism of action for this really isn't completely understood, but it is getting into small blood vessels. It does start to attach itself to the lining of the blood vessels. And as it gets into smaller and smaller blood vessels, it's causing clots. And that is the cause of the strokes, primarily in, believe it or not, patients who are 25 to 40. So an age range that you wouldn't normally expect to see strokes in. So the long-term consequences of this virus and the long-term medical conditions that it creates are I want to say, almost unprecedented. The long haulers, you've seen the stories about the people who have symptoms just for months after being diagnosed, is not all that surprising. That also was shown to be the case with SARS, which was the coronavirus that was a mini pandemic in 2004. So I think it's probably a hallmark of coronavirus, but this one goes widely in the body and produces some really significant and long-term permanent side effects. A lot of these are likely due to, again, not completely studied, but likely due to the hyperimmune response of the body itself. So the inflammation primarily, and that's certainly true for heart. But it has also been shown that there is virus in the heart muscle itself. So it's not just the hyperimmune response.
Thank you.
Can I address the comment about over-the-counter meds?
Yes.
Great. I'd like to, I've seen a few papers on this. I get the medical journals all the time. And these are all the papers I'm going to mention have to do with surveys. They're not placebo-controlled, double-blind, so you have to be careful there. But people who took aspirin were routinely taking aspirin or after they got COVID diagnosis were 43% less likely to go to the intensive care unit. And that is because, and that's one of the standard therapies now. That's one of the things that Trump got when he got COVID, because that helps reduce the amount of clotting that is it causes some of these side effects. People who took melatonin, surprisingly, that's one natural thing you take for sleep. In a pretty big survey, thousands of people, 30% less likely to catch COVID or to get symptomatic COVID. So some of the other things that Trump got, there's been some, again, these small amount of evidence, but to me, the risk of taking melatonin is pretty low. I take it every night myself. But zinc, vitamin D, there's been correlation with people who take vitamin D and less disease. And of course, there's two proven therapies. That's dexamethasone that suppresses your immune system once you're in the hospital, and remdesivir that shortens the stay in the hospital. So those have been approved by the FDA.
Thank you. Question about UV disinfectant lights installed in HVAC systems. How about using ceiling fans in Gothic arched buildings, I guess, increased risk or decreased if someone infected?
Yeah, UV definitely kills the virus. That's one of the ways they actually use to kill virus when they're making vaccines. So UV kills the virus, ozone kills the virus. Of course, these filters that they use, air purifiers, room type, or in your air conditioning system. And high ceilings are a good thing because that just gives you more air to dilute the virus with.
But I will say, again, depending on how many people are in the room and whether or not someone is asymptomatic but shedding virus, those UV filters, the HEPA filters, they're only good until the air crosses over an infected person, and then that air is no longer clean. So it's not a residual cleaning. It's only clean at the point of exit. And so don't rely on them. I mean, like I said before, there is no risk-free to get people in a building. There's just layers of protection.
Good point. Right. It sure helps to filter the air and everything, but it's not perfect.
That's right.
And I think that exact observation also applies to the question about masks.
Yes.
Yes, earlier the stress was that my mask protects you, your mask protects me. And more recently, there have been reports that the self-protection aspect of masks was underestimated somewhat. It doesn't reduce the extent to which it protects others, but it does help protect you to wear a mask.
Right.
In terms of what mask fabric and construction are the best, I think Rich had a good statement about that earlier. You definitely, if you have a cloth mask, 2 layers is much better than 1. You don't want to be able to see through it. Some of them have filters which can be inserted into the mask holder. That is helpful because then you have multiple layers. And again, the more layers, in principle, the better.
There's also a follow-up question about high ceilings are good, but should ceiling fans be run? I'm not an expert, but I would say that depends on which way the air is being pulled by the ceiling fan.
Right.
So if the ceiling fan is pushing it down, that's not a great thing, because what you're doing is you're pushing it down and pushing it out. And if you've got infected people sitting in the pews, you're circulating that virus. I know the organizational nonprofit that oversees HVAC and air conditioning, it's called ASHRAE, had done a study, and they said this proves that you should have air circulating for the virus, but they did it with smoke and said, see, dispersion is good. You don't want it hanging around. Well, that's true for smoke. It's not true for a virus. You don't want to spread the virus around to get more people infected because the infection is exponential. So if Rich and Bill and I are in a room and one of us is infectious, I infect them, they go out and the three of us are going to infect 3 more people. And then those 9 people are going to infect 81. And then those 81 are going to infect, and it goes like that. And so the bottom line is to use common sense in terms of keeping airflow fresh and not recirculated as much as possible. And so I haven't answered your questions. I think it's better if you're pulling the air up and putting it through one of those filters or through a UV unit. But if you're just pushing it down on people who are potentially infected, not a great idea.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, Lindsay Marr is a name. She's the world's top exit, MARR. She writes in Time Magazine and publishes papers, and LANSEY Marr. If you want to Google her, she recommends using ceiling fans. But of course, I agree with Lisa that it's better to pull it up. But of course, it goes up and then it gets dispersed and then it
Right.
comes back down on you, but at least it's spread out, it's more dispersed. And so I wanted to answer the thing about Christmas caroling too. We're having outdoor services at First Pres Bethlehem. And I think we're perfectly fine. We wear masks. And I think Christmas caroling, we're going to have a Christmas Eve service outside at 4 o'clock, so it's a little bit light. We're going to have kids there and everything else. We have chalk where we kind of, when we have people who don't know the system, we kind of make little boxes of 10 feet for each family unit. Actually, once people got used to that, we don't have to do that for our regulars. But on Christmas Eve, we'll have non-regulars. And so I'd be perfectly okay with Christmas caroling with masks on outside.
It's great. So I think we've got a closing question here. Bottom line, if you were asked if churches should be closed until the vaccine is available, what would you say?
My advice would be if right now you have considered yourself able to be open to a limited socially distanced population, you could continue at that level until the vaccine is available. But again, when the vaccine is available, it's not going to be switching a light, like a light switch. You're going to have to wait and see both what the uptake is and what's the community infection rate. Right now, for example, it's extremely high. In August, depending on where you were, it was not as high and the risk was therefore lower. It's all about risk. Again, personally, I certainly would not be comfortable between now and April with having unfettered attendance as though we were back to normal. In all honesty, we are not back to normal yet. We won't be until some reasonable time after the vaccine comes out. I don't know
Rich,
if anyone.
what do you think?
Oh, well, I'm in favor of keeping completely closed for now, especially. In fact, we used to let Boy Scouts come into our church. As long as the parents didn't come in, they had to go outside to get picked up, and there was only like 15 of them, and there was a big room. Now we said, no, don't come in. And it's just not worth the risk, especially because the vaccine is coming soon and just lasts a little longer, but it definitely, in my opinion, is not worth the risk. Now, we do have a nursery school going still. And to me, that is risky. But of course, as somebody pointed out, there's other risk of if other than the virus, and that is, if people lose their income, they can't work, and that kind of thing. And so if you have over 2-year-olds wearing masks and keeping as far as apart as possible, hand washing and all that, and if a kid isn't cooperative, you treat them the same way as a kid who's biting or something like that. You just say, okay, if you're going to keep doing this, then you can't come back. So so there is some risk, but it's less if it's the same group, if it's pods, and the people are taking precautions.
And my answer, I gave one of these yesterday for Whitewater Valley Presbytery, and my answer was, if I were Queen of PCUSA, I would make sure that churches stayed closed. It isn't worth the risk. People are not behaving. That's partly why the community spread is as bad as it is.
Yes.
We are not, in the United States, we aren't nearly as good as the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is spiking right along with us, and the numbers are not looking good. So I would say go back to whatever decision trees you have in place and keep an eye on the local numbers using that covidactnow.org website or the CDC website. It allows you to go county by county. Pay attention to hospital bed utilization in your area. That is a particularly thorny and somewhat insidious part of that evaluation. I have churches that are still back. There tend to be large sanctuaries with about 1/10 of their capacity inside, and it still makes me uncomfortable. I would close it down until spring, till you can go back outside, and then to Bill's point, see where the vaccination utilization is and decide from there.
And I would just add to that, to me, it makes sense to use the video technology that you have available. Ask your presbytery to help, with funds to get that going. Because even after the virus, even after you go back into your building, you're going to need to continue with the video.
Mhm.
We're moving into a hybrid situation where from here on out, we're going to be needing to do both as the church. So you might as well get up and running now when you need it. Just my 2 cents worth.
Agree.
Okay, if I don't want to keep you all any longer, we so much appreciate your expertise and your willingness to share, and the fact that you are all, church people and understand how church people are thinking is very, very helpful. And so blessings on you, blessings on your Thanksgiving celebrations to all of you. And as I noted in the chat, I will be posting the recording so that you can share it with others who couldn't be here today. So thank you very much.
I think we were scheduled to 1:15, but so I'm happy to hang around if other people want to leave, but I'm happy to hang around if anyone wants to.
Yeah.
I don't think we answered all the questions yet, but go ahead.
Okay. Did you see any that we didn't answer?
Just one thing to clarify, my mask protects me and also protects you both, because as you can imagine, the virus, the mask is not a one-way thing. It's not going to go, it's going to stop virus going either direction. So that's how I look at it.
One question was on the COVID app for evaluation of close contacts. I think certainly that's something that different people will assess differently in terms of information sharing. It really is not intended to share information. There are some degree of protections in place, and it's up to individuals how comfortable you are or aren't with that. I have gotten that. I don't know how useful it will be, but it's another way to try to protect myself and others. So that's why I've done that.
I just added the covidactnow.org in the chat. Somebody had asked for that. Somebody also asked, is nasal cleaning and cleansing effective? The answer to that is really no, because the virus is going to go way deeper into your system than nasal cleansing will be. You'd have to be cleansing almost perpetually for it to do any good. And the honest truth is, by the time you're washing, you're also washing away some of the mucus protection that will prevent the virus from getting into the cells. And so I know that there's a lot of ancient Ayurvedic medicine about a neti pot and cleansing and getting pollutants and things like that out, but it can also strip if you do it too much. And so it's probably not helpful for this virus.
I agree. Although I have seen that, mouthwashes, some of them are germicidal. And
Yeah.
somebody said, you just take the mouthwash maybe 3 times a day, and if you're going to go meet people, it's not going to protect you. As Lisa said, it virus is all over the place. But maybe there's a theoretical consideration. They do kill viruses, that maybe you'll be spraying less out when you go in public.
Yep.
Every little bit helps in a lot of ways, and this is one way to help a little bit.
Right. So does anybody have any questions that we missed? I'm scrolling through. Rhonda, did you see any that we missed?
I was looking too.
Or does somebody unmute yourself and just say it if we missed your question?
So there is a question. Alan's asked about the common cold is generally held to be a coronavirus, and cold-E zinc glutamate has been clinically proven to have benefits against common cold. Does zinc glutamate, I'm assuming the syllogism is, does it work against COVID-19? Not all common colds are COVIDs. There's a lot of rhinovirus and other viruses that cause colds as well. There are 4 types of coronavirus that are associated with the common cold. I would personally, and I spent a lot of time in the OTC respiratory world with Vicks when I worked for Procter. I don't believe that zinc has been clinically proven to have benefits against a cold. I think that's anecdotal. And I would not go so far as to say that. I have not seen any data that says zinc as an applicant is effective against COVID in any way, shape, or form. Zinc as a supplement is not a bad thing to take along with vitamin D and other things, just in terms of keeping your immune system at peak operating capacity.
Yeah, I agree. There's a little harm, and who knows, it might be some good. Whereas there's 4 coronaviruses that do cause colds, there's hundreds of rhinoviruses,
right,
and Coxsackie viruses and all the other viruses. And so it's only a very minor portion of the cold viruses. Well, I think, any more questions? Unmute yourself or do we catch them
You
all?
have clearly answered every's
Great.
questions.
They're
Great.
just tired of
thanks.
hearing us.
I don't want to miss
So-
anybody, but thank you.
You have been very, very, very clear, and we appreciate it.
Could I
Okay.
You
ask
guys
just
be
one?
blessed and have a great Thanksgiving.
Could I ask just
Thank
one real quick
you.
question before y'all go?
Yep.
Sure.
So I have asthma and I preach with a mask on. I found a mask guard that I put inside the mask that really helps me to breathe. Does that do anything to impact the effectiveness of the mask, or is it still perfectly safe?
It's perfectly safe as long as it's still covering your nose and your mouth and isn't allowing air in. So if it's not acting like a face shield, which allows a lot of air underneath it, as long as your mask is still intact, it would be an extra layer of protection. I've heard a lot of people say that that does help them breathe when they're using the mask, especially musicians.
Thank you.
Yes.
A question.
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
there was the question on a transplant recipient on anti-rejection meds. the
And-
risk and response with the vaccine.
Yes, and again, the more focused trials on a sub-segment of the population like that, while absolutely critical to do, hasn't been done yet, as far as I'm aware.
Right.
In principle, I would be very cautious under those situations. Any situation where one's immune system is suppressed, which would be the case with the anti-rejection meds,
Right.
you'd want to be extremely cautious.
Yeah, I would certainly take the vaccine because it certainly might do some good, but I wouldn't assume that I was completely protected.
Yeah, and that one for me, that's up to you and your individual physician. If you're on transplant meds, you've got an army of medical personnel walking along with you. I would make sure that you got their recommendation.
Great.
What link would we use to access this? Again, I'm at Dairy Presbyterian in Hershey, and this would be excellent for others on our task force to see.
Well, we will, I will be sending a link to the recording out to all the presbytery leaders in the synod. The executives and the state clerks are on a chat group or a Google group, email group that we use. It will also be posted at lehighpresbytery.org. So that's by tomorrow. You'll be able to find it there.
Great.
Great.
So back to Ruth Ann's question. Was she talking about those frames? They're kind of like plastic frames that you put in a mask?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. As long as it's sealing around the outside, that's the effectiveness of the mask. It's good to have it. The better the seal, the better off you are.
Right.
Okay. All righty. Thank you all, and we'll
Bye.
see you
Take
Thank you.
care.
sometime soon.
Thank you.
Blessings.
Bye. Good luck with your churches.